Mark Reynolds stood before the mirror in his modest apartment, smoothing the plain gray t-shirt over his broad shoulders, adjusting the cap low over his brow and taking a deep breath that felt heavier than usual. For years he had presided over Reynolds Capital with a commanding presence, a firm that had blossomed from a modest local investment outfit into a regional powerhouse, managing billions in assets and guiding hundreds of employees toward success. Yet despite the glossy reports and booming profits, Mark felt a growing distance between the towering glass offices where decisions were made and the cluttered, busy branches where his employees battled the grind of daily challenges. He wondered, what was it really like for those who counted on this company not just for paychecks but for dignity, respect, and a chance to build their futures? The question gnawed at him, pulling him toward a decision few CEOs would dare to make. To truly understand his firm's heartbeat, he would become invisible. He would become one of them. An ordinary employee blending into the hum of daily routine, a faceless cog in the machine. The idea wasn't born of curiosity alone, but from a deep-rooted sense of responsibility, a desire to bridge the widening gap between leadership and labor, profit and people. So, with a small backpack and a heart pounding with both anticipation and uncertainty, Mark stepped into the world beyond the boardroom. At the Reynolds Capital branch downtown, the air was thick with urgency. Phones ringing off the hook, tellers juggling customers with weary smiles, managers navigating endless paperwork under fluorescent lights. Here, Mark shed his tailored suits and polished shoes for worn sneakers and a simple uniform that rendered him nearly invisible. The shift was immediate. No assistant to smooth his path, no entourage to cushion his steps. Instead, he stood behind a counter, smiling nervously as a customer handed him a deposit slip, feeling the weight of responsibility in the mundane transaction. Each day brought new lessons, some humbling, others heart-wrenching. Mark saw firsthand the long hours, the juggling of impossible demands, the silent struggles behind exhausted eyes. He witnessed a teller's frustration when outdated software froze mid-transaction, a loan officer's quiet despair as another client was turned away due to inflexible policies, and the delicate balancing act of frontline staff managing both company goals and customer needs with grace and grit. Yet beneath the surface of stress and setbacks, he found moments of unexpected beauty, the sincere laughter shared during breaks, the subtle acts of kindness between colleagues, and the unwavering dedication that refused to waver despite the odds. These moments etched themselves into his heart. More than anything, Mark was struck by the resilience of his people, their hope and determination often invisible to those sitting in executive suites. He realized that success was not just measured in profit margins, but in the human stories that unfolded quietly behind every transaction, every phone call, every handshake. Night after night, as he removed his cap and uniform and returned to his high-rise office, Mark carried these stories with him, their weight reshaping his vision of leadership. His commitment deepened. No longer would he see his employees as mere numbers or faceless staff, but as individuals deserving of empathy, support, and meaningful change. This undercover journey was more than an experiment, it was a revelation, a call to action. When the time came to reveal his true identity, the surprise rippled through the branch like a wave, stirring emotions ranging from disbelief to gratitude. Mark spoke not as a distant CEO, but as a fellow worker who had walked in their shoes, who had seen the cracks and the courage that often went unnoticed. He promised tangible changes, better training, improved technology, flexible policies, and a renewed culture of respect and inclusion. His words were not empty rhetoric, but born from lived experience, from an intimate understanding earned in the trenches. In the weeks that followed, the ripple became a tide of transformation, as employees felt heard and valued, and the company's service to clients blossomed with renewed passion. Mark's undercover beginning was not just a story of disguise, but a testament to the power of humility and connection. It reminded everyone that leadership is not a pedestal, but a bridge, built on trust, compassion, and the courage to step into the lives of those you lead. Through his simple act of stepping down to step up, Mark ignited a movement that redefined what it meant to lead, inspiring a legacy far richer than profits, a legacy of genuine human connection. Mark Reynolds had rehearsed his role 100 times before stepping into the bank's polished lobby, but nothing could prepare him for the sudden, sharp grip on his collar. Without warning, the bank manager's hand closed around the fabric of his shirt. yanking him forward with a force that stole his breath. Mark's eyes widened, surprise flickering into quiet indignation as the manager's face twisted in suspicion and anger. "You're causing trouble here," the manager hissed, his voice low but fierce. The accusation hung heavy in the air, bold and unjust. Before Mark could gather his thoughts, a burst of laughter rang out, sharp, loud, and cruel. Jessica Blake, the bank's influential insider and daughter of a major stakeholder, stood nearby, her posture dripping with superiority. Her eyes sparkled with malicious amusement as she pointed directly at Mark, her voice carrying across the stunned crowd. "Oh my God, look at this guy. Can you believe they think he's some kind of threat?" She jeered, her laughter echoing off the marble walls. Others began to chuckle, caught up in her condescending tone. Mark's heart pounded. The eyes of every bystander were locked on him, some curious, some judgmental. His mind raced, but he held himself steady, the fire of resolve simmering beneath his calm exterior. This moment wasn't just an insult. It was a test of his patience, his dignity, and his unwavering purpose. Though the humiliation stung, Mark refused to break because what mattered wasn't the laughter. It was what he was here to uncover. And nothing, not even the harsh grip of a misguided authority or the cruel mockery of privilege, would stop him. Mark Reynolds stood in the center of the room, the weight of the humiliation pressing down on him like a suffocating fog. Voices around him whispered, some mocking, others dismissive. The sting of disrespect was sharp, a fire that could have easily cracked his composure. But Mark didn't flinch. Inside, his heart beat steady, his breath even and slow. The noise around him faded into a distant murmur. His eyes held a calm that was almost unnatural, not born from denial but from a deep, unwavering resolve. He reminded himself quietly, like a mantra, "This is bigger than this moment. This is not about them. This is about the vision." True leadership, Mark knew, was never about matching arrogance with anger or pride with pride. It was about humility, about patience, about holding fast when the world seemed determined to see you falter. Even as misunderstanding clouded the room, even as disdain tried to unravel his spirit, Mark stood grounded, his mind anchored to the future he believed in. He knew this moment was a test not of his ability to fight back, but of his strength to endure. And in that silence, in that stillness amidst the storm, Mark Reynolds revealed a power far greater than any shouted defense, the silent strength of unwavering purpose. Mark Reynolds stood in the hallway just beyond the polished glass doors of the boardroom, his expression unreadable. Behind him, the echo of laughter and whispered scorn still lingered, a thin, bitter fog that clung to his tailored suit more than any wrinkle ever could. They thought they'd broken him. The meeting had been brutal. Executives who once shook his hand with reverence had turned cold, disloyal. After a sharp downturn in quarterly results, fingers had pointed swiftly, and many had landed squarely on him. One man in particular, Harper, the self-satisfied CFO, had thrown a jab that hung heavier than the rest. Maybe the bank needs new blood. The industry's moved on. Mark hadn't responded. Not then. He had simply gathered his papers, nodded once, and walked out without a word. But silence, he knew, wasn't surrender. Now, with the weight of the bank's future pressing on his shoulders, Mark stepped aside into a quiet alcove. The hallway light flickered faintly above him, casting his reflection in the darkened window pane. There was no audience here, no posturing, just a man, his purpose, and a decision that had been months in the making. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. His hand trembled, not from fear but from the electric charge of the moment. With a slow breath, he dialed a number burned into his memory. "Get me legal and M&A," he said calmly when the line picked up. "It's time." Within minutes, 3 of his most trusted lieutenants were looped in, attorneys, strategists, deal-makers, who had waited patiently for this green light. Mark didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We're going through with the acquisition. All terms stand. Full offer, $900 million. I want signatures within the next 72 hours. Begin integration planning immediately." There was a stunned silence on the line. "Mark, you're sure?" one voice asked. "That's the move?" "That's the move," he said, steel in his voice. "This isn't just about recovery. It's about rewriting the game." It was more than a transaction. This deal, months in quiet negotiation, would shift the axis of the bank's future. With it, They would acquire not just a bleeding-edge fintech firm, but also a whole new market segment, a younger demographic, and a fresh narrative that investors couldn't ignore. It was bold, risky, and exactly what they needed. But for Mark, this call wasn't just a financial pivot, it was personal. That boardroom, those looks of doubt, of smug dismissal, they'd underestimated the fire behind his calm. They thought the bruises of public criticism would leave him paralyzed. What they didn't know was that Mark had been building this move brick by brick while they were busy pointing fingers. He wasn't reacting. He was executing. And in that moment, as he hung up the phone and slipped it back into his pocket, Mark didn't feel broken. He felt awakened. Power, he knew, didn't come from shouting the loudest in the room. It came from acting when it mattered most. From having the discipline to wait, the courage to strike, and the clarity to know when. He looked back at the boardroom doors, still slightly ajar, voices murmuring inside. He would walk back in shortly, not to defend himself, but to deliver the news calmly, surgically, like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The $900 million wasn't just a deal. It was a message. They may have doubted his leadership. They may have whispered behind his back. But by the time the ink dried, they would understand one thing. Mark Reynolds never lost control. He had simply chosen the perfect moment to remind them who he was. Word of Mark's deal spread like wildfire through the halls of the bank. It began with whispers, quiet murmurs from assistants who had overheard calls, half-read emails forwarded in a panic. And then just like that, it was everywhere. One bold decision from the man no one had taken seriously had shifted the very ground beneath them. Jessica Blake was still in her office when the news came through, sipping her morning latte and laughing with a colleague about the intern-turned-hero who had stormed out of the shareholders' gala the night before. She'd always found Mark amusing in a harmless sort of way, earnest, awkward, a little too passionate for someone so low in the hierarchy. Then her assistant burst in, pale and breathless. "Jessica, you need to see this." It took just one headline to wipe the amusement from her face. "Billion-dollar deal signed by Mark Dalton exposes internal bank discrepancies." She stared at the screen in disbelief. Mark had bypassed protocol, made a deal with one of the bank's most elusive partners, and done it all without her, without the board, without anyone's blessing. It was reckless. It was brilliant. It was impossible. Within minutes, Jessica's phone lit up with calls from every corner of the bank. Directors, partners, legal. Everyone wanted answers. The man they had overlooked, ignored, belittled, underestimated, had made a move that not only exposed cracks in the bank's leadership, but threatened to redefine the future of their investments. Downstairs, in the executive suite, the bank manager, Harold Lorne, was in a rage. His voice thundered through the glass walls of the conference room as he tore through reports, demanding explanations, demanding control. "How the hell did this happen under our noses?" he barked. "Who approved this? Who let him near that deal?" No one had answers. No one had even seen it coming. But slowly, as the full details of the deal emerged, Harold's fury gave way to something far more unsettling: concern. Because the deal, as it turned out, was airtight. Legally sound, strategically potent, it exposed inefficiencies that had been swept under the rug, brought new partners into the fold, and offered massive returns for the bank's future, if they could manage the fallout. The stakeholders convened in emergency meetings, faces drawn, fingers steepled, voices hushed. Some were worried, others intrigued, a few impressed. "I didn't think he had it in him," one murmured. "Shows more guts than half the executive board," said another. Jessica sat silently through the meetings, a slow-burning tension in her chest. The very structure she had helped fortify, one of control, hierarchy, status, was cracking under the weight of Mark's audacity. And as much as she wanted to dismiss him, to write it off as a one-time fluke, she couldn't, because what he had done wasn't just bold. It was smart, strategic, and deeply personal. He hadn't just acted like a leader. He had been one. The atmosphere in the bank shifted almost overnight. Where there had once been smug confidence, there was now hesitation. Where Mark had once been dismissed as an eager junior analyst, he was now being spoken of with quiet respect, and more than a little fear. Rumors swirled. Some said he had been planning it for weeks. Others speculated he was working with whistleblowers or external regulators. But the truth was simpler and more unsettling. He had seen something they hadn't. He had done something they hadn't. Harold called a closed-door session with the board and demanded an internal review. We need to know who he talked to, what documents he accessed, and how he managed to get approval signatures. We cannot afford another move like this going unchecked. But even as investigations began, a more difficult conversation loomed. What if Mark wasn't the problem? What if he was the future? Jessica found herself alone in her office late that night, long after the last lights had dimmed in the building. She stared out at the city skyline, her reflection faint in the window, uncertain, shaken. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't felt in her carefully curated career: doubt. She thought about the way she'd treated Mark, the condescension, the smirks, the missed opportunities to really listen. He had walked among them like an intern, but now he had walked right through them, untouched, undeniable. Somewhere out there, Mark Dalton had changed the game, and now the bank would have to decide: fight him or follow him. The tension in the bank's executive office was almost physical, thick and pressing, like a storm just before it breaks. Jessica Blake stood tall, arms crossed, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she paced. Her eyes were sharp, accusing. Across from her, the bank manager sat behind his sleek mahogany desk, face tight with frustration. And between them, calm, still, and composed, stood Mark Reynolds, the man they had both doubted for far too long. "This isn't some stunt you can explain away," Jessica snapped. "You misled us. You played games with people's livelihoods. Who exactly do you think you are?" Mark didn't flinch. He met her anger with quiet resolve. "I think," he said slowly, "I'm the only person in this room who saw the truth and acted on it." The bank manager let out a derisive breath. "Truth? You've been nothing but a disruption, hiding your identity, lying about your intentions, and now you want us to believe you were some sort of undercover savior?" Mark turned to him unfazed. "Not a savior, just someone who saw a chance to fix something before it broke beyond repair." Jessica narrowed her eyes. "Start talking." "All of it now," Mark nodded. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. Instead, he calmly unfolded the story he had kept hidden, not out of pride but necessity. Weeks earlier, Mark had been sent by a major investment group to assess the bank's troubled loan department, secretly. Posing as a low-level analyst, he had embedded himself inside the system, watching, listening, collecting every red flag that was being ignored. It was never about sabotage. It was about strategy. The group he represented wasn't interested in gutting the bank. They wanted to save it, but only if it proved worth saving. And it was. But only because Mark fought behind the scenes to give them a reason. "I brokered a deal," he continued, eyes meeting Jessica's. "It secures the bank's future. It protects the staff. It saves your department, and more importantly, it keeps this institution from collapsing under its own arrogance." Jessica's face hardened at the word. Arrogance. She'd worn it like armor. Every step of her career had been built on control, certainty, superiority. And now that very arrogance had blinded her, to the truth, to Mark's intentions, and to her own misjudgment. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. Her thoughts warred behind her eyes. How many times had she dismissed Mark? Talked over him? Treated him like someone beneath her simply because he didn't flaunt his credentials or beg for recognition? It stung. Deeply. Not because he was right, but because she had been so very wrong. "You knew all along," she said finally, her voice quieter. "You let me mock you, question you, and you never said a word." Mark gave a soft, sad smile. "You weren't ready to hear it." The bank manager cleared his throat, discomfort blooming across his face. His own memories of coldness, dismissiveness, and barely disguised disdain came rushing back. He had judged Mark as another ambitious junior, trying to climb the ladder without earning it. He had been harsh, curt, unnecessarily so. And yet here Mark stood, not with a grudge, but with salvation. "You saved us," the manager said, almost to himself, "even when we gave you every reason not to." Mark shrugged slightly. "I wasn't here for recognition. I was here to see if this place could still be something worth saving. Jessica looked away, her throat tightening. The weight of her pride sat heavily on her chest. For the first time in years, she didn't feel powerful. She felt human. I misjudged you, she admitted, voice cracking just slightly. And I'm sorry. Mark looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just the executive, not just the polished facade, but the woman beneath it. Strong, yes, but flawed, and willing finally to see it. We all do, he said gently. What matters is what you do after. A long silence fell over the room. Then the bank manager rose from his chair. His face was softer now, the edges no longer sharp with ego. He extended a hand. Mr. Reynolds. Thank you. Truly. Mark took it, the gesture firm and genuine. Jessica stepped back, her expression no longer one of defiance, but of quiet transformation. A part of her had broken open, and something better was beginning to grow in its place. This confrontation hadn't just exposed the truth, it had changed them all. Jessica Blake had never been the type to second-guess herself. Confident, sharp-witted, and unapologetically direct, she had built a reputation for being a force to be reckoned with. Her words were her weapons, and for a long time, she wielded them with little concern for collateral damage. To her, pride wasn't a flaw, it was armor, and mocking those who didn't measure up to her standards felt more like a reflex than a choice. But the day she humiliated Mark in front of the entire office had left a mark that even she couldn't ignore. At the time, it had seemed so trivial. A cutting remark, a raised eyebrow, laughter that echoed too loudly in a room that had suddenly gone too quiet. Mark, always composed, had said nothing in return. He'd simply nodded, swallowed his dignity, and carried on with his work. Jessica had moved on too, or so she thought. But something about his silence had lingered with her. Not out of guilt, at least not immediately, but out of discomfort. The kind that comes when you know you've crossed a line but can't quite bring yourself to admit it. It wasn't until days later, when she overheard two employees speaking in hushed tones about what Jessica did to Mark, that the realization began to settle in. She wasn't being admired for her confidence anymore. She was being watched, judged, quietly distanced. Her power, once rooted in control, now felt shaky, uncertain, and worse, it was no longer respected. It was feared. For the first time, Jessica saw her behavior not through the lens of her own intentions, but through the eyes of the people she worked with. And what she saw wasn't strength, it was cruelty. Her pride had turned into a weapon she'd used against the very people she was supposed to lead, and Mark, the quiet, dependable colleague she had dismissed so thoughtlessly, had borne the brunt of it. That truth struck her deeper than she expected. It wasn't just about one bad moment, it was about a pattern, one that had gone unchecked for far too long. Jessica knew that private guilt wasn't enough. Not this time. If she wanted to change, truly change, she had to face the people she had hurt, starting with Mark. So with her heart pounding and her voice carefully steady, she stood before her team in the next meeting. No smugness, no rehearsed charm, just sincerity, raw, trembling, and real. She looked directly at Mark first. I need to start with you, she said. What I said and how I treated you, and none was wrong. Deeply wrong. I spoke from a place of pride and I hurt you in front of everyone. You didn't deserve that. Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't shy away from the emotion. She let it show. I was wrong and I'm sorry. Then she turned to the rest of the room, a team that had grown distant from her without her even realizing it. To all of you, I owe an apology as well. I've led with ego, not with empathy. I've used sarcasm and superiority when I should have been listening and supporting. I thought I was being strong, but I see now that I was being small. There was a heavy silence. No one quite knew how to respond. But in that quiet, Jessica felt something shift, not outside of her, but within. This wasn't about gaining back respect. It wasn't a performance. It was the first honest step in making things right. I can't undo the damage I've done, she continued. But I can promise you this, I'm going to learn from this. I'm going to lead differently, with humility, with respect. And if I ever forget that again, I want you to remind me. Hold me accountable. Her words hung in the air like a vow, not grand, not dramatic, but steady and sincere. Mark nodded slightly, and though he said nothing, the faint expression on his face, not forgiveness but acknowledgement, was more than she deserved. Jessica knew her apology wouldn't fix everything. Redemption doesn't happen in a single moment. But it starts with one, a moment where pride is set aside and truth takes its place. For her, this was that moment, the first of many she hoped in a journey toward becoming the kind of leader and the kind of person who builds others up rather than tearing them down. She walked away from that meeting a little lighter, not because the burden was gone, but because she was finally willing to carry it with honesty. Mark Reynolds wasn't the kind of leader who believed in ruling from above. He believed in knowing, really knowing, and the people he worked with and the world they moved through every day. So when whispers of employee burnout and declining morale began to reach him, subtle at first, buried beneath layers of polite professionalism, he didn't just ask for reports. He went undercover. For weeks, Mark stepped away from his title as CEO and blended in as a junior employee at the very bank he had once helped build. He wore the uniform. He answered calls. He handled complaints from impatient customers. He watched. He listened. And what he saw changed him. He saw stress behind practiced smiles. He heard team leaders speak with urgency but not compassion. He watched employees skip lunches, take on extra shifts, and carry invisible weight just to meet expectations that had long since outgrown reality. Most of all, he saw good people doing their best in a system that had forgotten they were human. When Mark returned to his office, no longer just as a CEO, but as someone who had felt the struggle firsthand, he wasn't the same. And neither was the company. He didn't make noise about it at first. There were no grand announcements, no self-congratulatory emails. Just a quiet shift in energy as new policies began to appear. Policies rooted in empathy, shaped by experience. He implemented mandatory breaks for frontline staff. Not optional, mandatory. Wellness days were introduced not as a reward but as a right. Mental health support, previously buried in the HR handbook, was brought front and center with real resources and human conversations. He simplified reporting systems, eliminated outdated performance metrics, and created channels where employees could give feedback, anonymously if they wished, and be heard. But it wasn't just about improving conditions for employees. Mark understood that customer service was the outward reflection of inner culture. If employees were tired, unseen, or undervalued, that feeling would ripple outward. And it had. So he restructured customer interaction training, not with scripts but with stories. Real experiences from real employees. He emphasized empathy over efficiency, connection over speed. A bank, he told his management team, is not just where people keep their money. It's where they entrust their dreams, homes, education, retirement. If we forget that, we've lost the point. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Change never does. There was skepticism at first, some thinking it was a PR move, others doubting anything would truly shift. But Mark stayed the course. He made his visits to branches routine, not staged. He spoke with tellers, not just executives, and slowly something began to bloom. Employees started to smile for real. Turnover dropped. Customer satisfaction began to rise, not just because service was faster, but because it felt human. The bank's culture, once rigid and hierarchical, softened into something more collaborative. Respect flowed both ways, from leadership to staff, and from staff back to leadership. Mark had given them something rare, a reason to believe that someone at the top was listening. His story spread quietly at first, a tale passed in break rooms and team chats. "You know, Mark was undercover for a month," someone would say. And it wasn't just impressive. It was inspiring. Because in a world where leaders often claim to care, here was someone who had lived it, seen it, and acted on it. Mark's vision wasn't just about policies. It was about people. It was about rebuilding trust in an institution that had long been seen as cold and mechanical. Under his leadership, the bank entered a new chapter, one defined not just by numbers on a balance sheet, but by a culture of transparency, respect, and growth. He didn't need to be applauded. He didn't do interviews boasting about the turnaround. The reward for him was seeing employees who felt proud to come to work. It was watching a young teller speak up in a team meeting because she finally believed her voice mattered. It was hearing a customer say, "This feels different, better." Mark Reynolds had gone undercover to understand the truth, and what he brought back wasn't just insight. It was vision. A vision that didn't rely on authority but on authenticity. A vision that proved real leadership doesn't come from a title, but from the courage to change and the humility to listen. And in doing so, he became not just the head of a bank, but the heart of it. They used to laugh at him behind closed doors. Mark Reynolds wasn't the loudest voice in the room. He didn't carry the swagger that many of his peers wore like armor. In an industry built on bravado and bottom lines, Mark was different. Measured, quiet, unshakably composed. Some mistook that for weakness. Others dismissed it entirely. Early in his career, he had been humiliated, publicly. A presentation he spent months preparing was ridiculed by senior executives. A promising deal he championed was shot down and later claimed by someone else. He was left out of key meetings, overlooked for promotions, and often asked to stay in his lane. Colleagues called him too soft for the game. The whispers hurt, but Mark never reacted. He listened, learned, and waited. Behind the silence, something was growing. Clarity. Years passed, and while others chased titles and short-term wins, Mark played the long game. He built quiet alliances. He studied patterns, policies, and people. He saw how fear disguised itself as ego, and how good intentions were often lost in the race for recognition. He took the hits with humility but never lost sight of something deeper, a vision, not just for deals but for transformation. Then came the crisis. The bank, once untouchable, was sinking. A combination of reckless leadership, broken trust, and a rapidly shifting market had brought it to the edge. Investors pulled out. Regulators stepped in. Morale collapsed. The very people who once led with arrogance were now scrambling to save their careers. The bank needed more than a bailout. It needed a lifeline and a leader. All eyes turned to Mark quietly, confidently. He stepped forward. What followed became legend. Mark negotiated a $900 million deal that stunned the industry, not just in its size but in its strategy. It wasn't about inflating numbers or masking losses. It was about renewal. His plan combined innovative fintech integration, community-driven investment, and a sweeping cultural overhaul. It wasn't just about saving the bank's balance sheet. It was about restoring its soul, and it worked. Within 18 months, the bank not only stabilized, it began to thrive. But the money was only part of the story. What truly changed was the culture. Gone were the politics and pretense. Mark's leadership brought in transparency, ethical lending, and a renewed focus on mentorship and inclusion. People started speaking up without fear. Talent rose based on merit, not connections. Respect became the new currency. For the first time in years, the bank felt human again. Mark didn't take credit. In interviews, he deflected praise to his team. He walked the floors of every branch, shaking hands, listening, remembering names. He insisted on quarterly town halls, not for show, but for truth. When asked what changed, employees didn't cite policies or numbers. They pointed to a feeling, a sense that they mattered. He never raised his voice, yet people leaned in when he spoke. He never bragged, yet people quoted his words. In an industry where deals are remembered and faces forgotten, Mark left something that couldn't be measured in dollars, a legacy. Within the banking community, his name became shorthand for a new kind of leadership, rooted in humility, patience, and quiet strength. Business schools dissected his turnaround strategy. Competitors tried to replicate his culture. But what they couldn't duplicate was the way Mark made people feel seen. Even years later, when his portrait was quietly hung in the bank's main lobby, the plaque beneath it didn't mention the $900 million deal. It read, "He brought us back to who we were meant to be." For those who once doubted him, there was reflection, and for many, regret. But Mark never held grudges. That too was part of his strength. He believed in second chances. After all, he'd built his career on one. Mark Reynolds didn't set out to become a legend. He just refused to lose himself in a world that told him to be someone else. And in doing so, he changed everything. Not with force, but with faith. Faith in people. In patience. In doing what's right, even when it's unseen. That was the lesson he left behind. And in the echo of his legacy, the banking world was reminded, true leadership doesn't dominate. It dignifies.